there was a pub in Oxford, I think, called the Chanter, and their slogan was you can't get better banter than at the Chanter.
Oh, there we go. An English word. I think we're live right now.
This is all
and
valuable.
and welcome to Oliver explaining to us the meaning of banter, or what banter reminds him of.
It's an underutilized word in the English language, I think.
Totally underutilized. Right. So we're here today with Oliver, and Oliver is an angel, a VC investor, as well as an advisor, a startup advisor and mentor. Is there anything else I've left out from all of that long list?
No, it sounds like you got everything right there.
And that's how we met. And since then, we decided that we had to bring our conversations live, I think really is the best way to put it.
I mean, the whole world needs to understand the value of banter.
Everyone needs to understand. So talking about banter, today what we're going to be talking is about corporate innovation strategies. And that's really the reason why I brought you here today. And the best ways that companies can invest their time and their money in an innovation strategy that have frequently seen fail. But today you're going to tell us ways that we can be successful and avoid mishaps like Polaroid, Nokia, Yahoo even. I'd even say Yahoo I know is still there, but I think when I see a Yahoo email I'm thinking, wow, how come this person hasn't changed yet? And so many others that have got it wrong along the way.
Yes, yeah. We're going to dive into all that fun stuff, but from a very high level viewpoint here, because I think the topic can be quite dense, often misunderstood, and clear like roadmaps or I guess frameworks in which to work in are still in the process of being built, I would argue. It's kind of the nature of the beast to a degree. But hopefully we can do a good job.
So we're still trying to upload our PowerPoint, which we created a couple of minutes ago, which is the best thing about going live. Just for everyone to know why we're sitting here, just without showing you anything on screen. But briefly, what we're talking about is that there's a problem here, and I'm actually going to go straight into the first question I have for you. What is a business innovation strategy, and why is it so important to have one?
Yeah. So the really simple answer is just a business innovation strategy is a strategy which maybe more mature companies will utilize to be able to access innovation. And innovation can be a wide range of things, but it's effectively some form of change within the business, whether it's new business models, new technologies, etc. And so the strategy is like, how do you create systems around that to routinely be able to capture this like new value creation steps? Right. It sits within the much larger corporate strategy as well. I think sometimes there's a disconnect between larger corporate strategy development and then like the innovation strategy development. But we're going to talk about some examples going forward, which will hopefully like make that process a little bit clearer about what you should look at, and then setting appropriate KPIs, expectations, timescales, this sort of thing as well, because it's going to be different from what maybe more mature companies are used to.
When you talk about mature companies, what sort of size are we talking about? Because of course the definition of a mature company for me and a mature company for you are probably two different things.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a number of ways to look at maturity, not necessarily just purely looking at the age of a company. What we'll see in a second here will be, I guess, around revenue streams. And so you can say a mature company is one who's reaching potentially full utilization of their potential revenue. And so that product line or that service kind of has a lifespan that they're coming towards the end of. I think that in this case, that might be the best definition for mature company. But you can also define it so many other ways. It really depends on I guess, the use case here. There's no strict definition. Just like there's no strict definition for startup. Some companies are startups and they're worth billions of dollars, and you're like, well, that's an interesting definition of startup. So I would say the maturity of revenue streams is where we would probably want to go with that definition.
Well, okay, yes, maturity of revenue streams. I think it's interesting what you mentioned about a startup, because I remember I used to work with one, and there's about 50 of us, and I asked the CEO, I said, right, so when do we become a mature company, and when do we leave behind that tag of startup? And it's always a question of, what's the difference between, a group of entrepreneurs, a startup, or just a small business. But we can talk about that another day, if you like.
Yeah, it is a good question, though. How there's a secondary question there as well. As like, how important are these definitions? I would probably argue not that important, but I think in certain circumstances it does matter a lot.
Everyone likes to be boxed, and everyone likes to put a label on something.
Yeah.
So I think there's a need in society. Those of us who don't fit into that box system, we create a problem, and they don't know how to label us. And I think that's a problem. I think that's also why some of the best companies do succeed. And going back to Apple, some of the larger companies, why they're succeeding at the moment, because they won't put themselves in the box. But then, having said that, there are a few things that they do right. They've got a good innovation strategy. They get the fundamentals right.
Yeah.
They understand why they need one, and they understand the innovation landscape, which is a little bit what we're going to go into over now. And
yeah, so this graph
this
here. So maturity of revenue streams. I think this is an excellent example. This is a very popular example, I should say, of what's meant there. Is that for every product line, for every service, there's going to be a big growth phase, and then towards the end of that growth phase, you're going to see a falling off of revenue growth or even revenue, and then it will start to decrease as you maybe hit saturation, or people move on. There's new product lines, and the ideal time to say launch new innovation initiatives is as you peak for that revenue stream, and that way you already have an existing group of customers. You're able to recapture them, and then drive the next big revenue growth within the company. Because at the end of the day, kind of no matter what you're doing, if you're good at it, you're going to hit a peak where you just can't sell more to customers or to clients. Whether that's because you've got peak saturation, which I highly doubt, or if it's just because of the competitive landscape, you've kind of grabbed everybody, or even to try and acquire new clients is going to cost you too much money, because everybody's already heard of you. Those who are going to buy have already bought, and those who aren't going to buy, well, it's going to take a lot of money or something major to change that mindset. So this is why I would argue that innovation, and I think a lot of people argue that innovation can play such a key role for business. And one of the reasons why I argue that maturity, we're talking about maturity in terms of revenue streams as opposed to something else. Some of the fastest growing companies have just been able to release new features or something like that to keep, I guess, their existing consumers engaged, but also bring on more and more people as they grow.
I love the idea of the S curve, because it really is that, isn't it? It's as you reach your peak, that's when you should be thinking, or you should already have something that you can, as you said, a feature that you can bring out to market. But to have that, to bring that tailwind about, you do need a strategy behind it that's continuous, and you're thinking about long term, really. So you're not thinking, this is not a short-term strategy. This is a long-term strategy of how you're going to achieve your ultimate goal. So whether your ultimate goal is an API, is an exit of some sort. This is how you're going to achieve it. This is how you're going to reach those revenue streams. But how do you know? So is this something that you should have an R&D team inside the company? Is this, as you said, should we just be talking to customers to see, right, well, how will we create potential value for our customers? Is this just thinking about buying? I've seen a lot of competitors out there which are just buying up small businesses and then seeing how they can find their share of capturing the value from that M&A. I mean, how do you plan what strategy is right for you rather than listing out a ton of features, which as a startup, I'm not too sure if that's something, we've got a long roadmap ahead of us. And we always want to be building the beast, but sometimes more simpler is better, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. So that question of like what is the vehicle that you should use to facilitate innovation, I think comes down to a whole bunch of factors. Part of it is like what industry are you in? What are the sector dynamics? What is your competitive advantage? If you are in a high-tech industry and your competitive advantage is like a technological advantage, then internal R&D teams can be a very valuable way to utilize those resources, but it's a very long timeline. If you're in the fast food industry, for example, well, then you don't need an R&D team there. You can, accomplish that through maybe a marketing team or something along those lines. So I think there's a few things that need to be understood before we can kind of determine what is the best approach. One of them is like, what are your competencies? What do your clients want? The other one is like, what KPIs are you putting towards this sort of innovation? Is this?
I love it.
Well,
KPIs are so vast. You've got the vanity KPIs, which is what the board wants to see. Then you've got the real KPIs that actually drive value. So what sort of KPIs are we measuring here?
I think it comes down to some questions, which is like, what's the timeline that you're expecting results on? How much are you willing to pay? How much risk are you willing to take? And then off of these answers, you then develop some of those KPIs. This disconnect between, and I guess we'll talk about this more in a little bit, but why a lot of innovation fails is because of this like KPI disconnect that sometimes there is, where you have innovation teams, regardless of using a whole myriad of vehicles to try and accomplish something, and they don't match up with, say, corporate KPIs. It's been 2 years, they spent a whole bunch of money, and potentially the C-suite's like, well, why are we spending millions on this and we haven't seen any returns yet? And so this kind of comes back a little bit to the initial question, which is like, what is your overall strategy to accomplish as a whole, and how does that overall strategy fit into your innovation strategy? And then how are those KPIs communicated across the board? And for example, with this like KPI disconnect, there's numerous examples of saying the C-suite putting out a strategy saying they want to invest extensively in R&D and in new technologies because they feel like this is going to be the driving force of the company forward in the next like 3 or 4 years. However, they still hold their marketing team, they still hold their sales team to the old KPIs without necessarily understanding that, if you're investing more in R&D and there's not as much money for, say, marketing, etc., you might see a decline in sales in the short term. But they're holding staff to the same standards that might be unrealistic given this new shift of resources. And that can slow down both the sales and marketing teams, but also the innovation efforts.
I'm going to ask you a horrible question here. So to avoid so what you're talking about is the decentralized autonomous teams within an organization. So you have, you have marketing and sales and R&D and IT, everyone pursuing their own practices, their own interests, everyone with their own ideas. and everyone can find new ways to innovate, or create an innovation strategy within the company. So how do we avoid that and ensure that we're connecting innovation to strategy from a top-down level inside the company? It's always the hardest question, which I get asked an awful lot, especially from the marketing phase. How do I get buy-in from management? I guess this might be the other way around. So how does management get, or how does the board get buy-in from everyone else? Or is this, more, how does marketing, or how does sales, how does R&D get buy-in? Which way around are we looking at this?
Yeah, that's a very complex question. Thanks.
This is why we're bringing this live. These are our conversations.
I think as a whole, if you look at some of the research out there, things like top-down management styles tend not to be very good in innovation situations. And usually flat management styles or flat hierarchies tend to deliver a lot better on, as a generalization within innovation. And I guess it then comes down to like, what vehicle are you using for the innovation methodologies here? So I'm not sure if there's like a universal rule that can be applied, although I don't actually know. But usually just driving something like innovation, because it is such a cultural thing in reality. And if you look at one of the biggest hurdles that has to be overcome, I'm fairly certain that research universally agrees with this sort of thing. With this next statement, I should say, is that culture is probably the biggest hurdle when it comes to any form of innovation within larger corporations. And that's because there is a big cultural difference there between, I guess, both working practices as well as expectations, as well as just mindset. Often in an innovation scenario, you don't really know what's going to work. You have some ideas, and depending on the type of innovation you're doing, you might be able to like create a proxy for what you think is going to happen, but largely it's a little bit unknown. Well, in maybe more traditional corporations, like larger corporations, large traditional practices, lots already been established. And so there's already an existing framework there, and working within an existing framework, and it becomes more predictable. If you spend.
Can I hear you? Yes. Are you there? No, I can't hear you. I've lost you for a second. Whilst we get you back again, I'll just put this up, which is the innovation landscape map, which is a little bit the different types of innovation. And as Oliver, I've got you back now, so you can explain. You can carry on what you're saying and then jump onto this.
I have no idea what happened there. Sorry. Yeah, I was just talking about like the different approaches, like culturally. I think this is a very interesting, I guess, tool to better understand innovation from a more mature corporate. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, I guess, position here. I first stumbled across it, as far as I know, it's like origin is from a professor, Gary Pisano. He wrote a article like why you need an innovation strategy in like Harvard Business Review, probably maybe close to a decade ago. And so I've seen a lot of variations about this as well. So one of the things you'll find is that people will redefine or will have like slightly different definitions across the board for these sort of things. But the very first like bottom quadrant here, which is you utilizing existing technology and is an existing business model, is like routine innovation, or maybe it's an incremental version of innovation. And this is something that a lot of companies do to renew their revenue streams. A popular example is like they release a new iPhone every year with largely it's the exact same phone that it was last year. Maybe it's a different color back, maybe it's slightly faster.
But new chargers, so that you have to pay, you have to buy the whole set.
Yeah. But this sort of practice rejuvenates the sales within that category. Intel does this with updating chips a little bit. There's never been a huge jump in I guess, chipset differences. I mean, there is over a long period of time, but year on year, it's largely the same. Fast food companies do this by releasing like special burgers or something like that. And there's an argument to be made that one of the reasons why something like Subway has seen their revenues declining is because they've never done anything new, right? It's always the same. The second area to look at here is utilizing existing technology, but a new business model. And this can actually be quite an interesting space. Arguably, you could see something like Netflix coming in and disrupting blockbusters being this. Streaming had already existed. However, no one had thought about a new way to, say, implement this sort of thing. And this can be very much something that organizations can look at as they move forward. Another example could be free software. I think the popular one is Google making Android operating system free.
Which is why I love my Samsung telephone so much.
Yeah, absolutely, right? It's a great way to disrupt what's happening. The bottom right here is like they call it radical innovation. I'm not sure how much you should really adhere to the terminology here, but this is like new technology, but with an existing business model.
So you're sort of thinking of like biotech at the moment, and Web3, things like that?
Web3 might not fit into it. I think an argument could be made that, say, like mRNA vaccine creation is a new form of technology, but largely the business model is still the same. You pay for the vaccine. You could argue that, and I think they do argue that, say, fiber optics within telecommunication technology is different. Business models stay the same. I would argue the same thing could be said about things like SpaceX or Starlink. New technology, as far as I know, the business model is the same. You pay for a subscription to get access to the internet. And then the top right hand, which is called architectural innovation, is a new business model and new technology. This tends to be, I would argue, this tends to be the most disruptive. The go-to example of this is how digital photography disrupted Panasonic and Kodak, where it's new technology and then there's a new business model associated with it because all the other aspects of the old business model are kind of redundant now that you're doing everything digitally. You don't need to go get film. There's no processing. There's really no need to engage with the company after you do the initial purchase. I've put in here, I guess, this internal, external in brackets. This is my designation, and this tends for me to see, like, I think routine and incremental innovation is more of an internal play, right? You don't really need anybody from the outside to come in and show you how that's done.
When you say internal, you mean by your R&D team, your company, a group of people which you designate to work together and discover how you can create value. Whereas when you say external, you mean maybe a merger and acquisition or working with an external company and partnering up. We'll find different. I'm sure you'll go over those shall we go through the? So we're looking a little bit here, aren't we?
We are. This is so like with the previous slide and with this slide, I think these are useful frameworks, but we shouldn't be like wholly dedicated to these because this is just a vantage point at which to view this. And even definitions within here, there's a lot of varying definitions. Like, where does an incubator and accelerator stop? I don't think many people can give you like hard and fast definitions.
Pretty good question.
Yeah.
When does it start and when does it start? Where is that little junction point? Exactly. And a lot of companies offer them as well, don't they? I mean, we're talking there's some huge companies that have their own. I don't want to promote any at the moment. Otherwise, I'll think that they're investing in us.
No, we're still not doing yet. We're still not doing yet. No, I think it is a question that, once again, maybe academics probably have hard and fast rules around this. From all my experience working with both corporate accelerators and corporate incubators, as well as non-independent accelerators and independent incubators. There's a bleeding of the lines between these definitions. So maybe in academia, there's like, this is exactly where this fits. I'm not sure I believe that in the real world. And so there is this like look for how do you find innovation as a whole or utilize innovation as a whole. And I think there's kind of like there's a ton of parameters you can look at, but it's this one parameter, which is, are you looking internally or are you looking externally? Because the tools you're going to utilize are different. And then often we look at these in like 3 phases. There's this discovery phase. There's this building phase where you're probably creating an MVP. You're getting a little bit of initial traction. There's a scaling phase, which is where you're doing this big ramp up and you're growing.
Wait a second, I was on mute. When you're talking about this discovery phase, it almost looks like a crowdsourcing phase for me, which is where I would go and find loads of potential investors, right? You've got a corporate company or a mature company finding lots of potential talent, let's call it that way. Am I looking at it right, or?
Yeah, so you've actually covered 2 different topics there a little bit. So there's definitely an external source for innovation, right? The external source can be open innovation projects, like challenge prizes, hackathons. A challenge prize is very simply, we're facing this problem or we want this solution. We'll pay, a couple $100,000. Submit all your best ideas. The discovery phase could be a company paying for a PhD student to do research, so basically funding someone's PhD, and then you get access to all that research. There's been a number of startups, say, in the biosensor space for like wearable sensors who've done that to develop new sensing technology. And then you also just have a solid like R&D branch, which is the internal mechanism you can use to try and identify and facilitate innovation. And often this can be very directed, where, if you're working in some deep tech or some technology process, what the next step is that would like radically change or maybe greatly influence your revenues. And so you have your R&D team work towards that, whether it's a new form of glass, a new alloy, maybe a different chipset, etc. So those are kind of the 2 big ones. Is you do have this open source external facing approach, and then you have this like actually quite, if you utilize it well, quite good internal team, which is the R&D team. And
I'm on mute because I've got wind in the background. Which is the best way that you'd say that a startup and a mature company could interact with each other? Because obviously so between the accelerator, the incubator, the venture studio, the strategic partner, which I know could fall into sort of venture clients as well. And I could say that I'm dipped in all of those different things, but is there, what am I looking for? What are you looking for? What should a company be looking for so what's the best way for a match to happen?
Yeah. So the answer you're not going to like is it really depends upon what the goal is. So let's take an example here of, let's say, Tyson Foods, which is the largest meat company in the world, or probably the US. I'm not sure where they exactly fall. They were actually, I believe they were an early investor in Beyond Meat. It was great for Beyond Meat. They had access to an industry-leading food producer, although of meat and Beyond Meat's anti-meat. It was also great for Tyson Foods because they then had insight into potentially quite a disruptive new product line that was becoming out. Just before Beyond Meat IPO, Tyson exited, I think making something like $70+ million, $79 million off the top of my head. And they've exited having had some experience, maybe not from an operational standpoint, but some experience in the new alternative protein sector. They see the threat that's going to be coming, and so then they've started their own alternative protein burgers, or like vegan or vegetarian burgers. And they've done that often off the back of, say, the information they got from that investment and the ability to see how the company works and the challenges they're going to have going forward. Venture clients, strategic partnerships, shared resources, on some levels, these are all the same thing. Once again, I'm sure someone could argue that there are differences there. I think for the purpose of this, we can just categorize them together. Why is this good? I think this is good for a number of reasons. It allows mature companies to see what startups are doing and to maybe be able to facilitate them, potentially to foster longer-term relationships further down the road. And it allows startups to grow significantly faster by having access to resources they might not have had. A recent example could be something like Pure Water Sports, which is an electric boat engine company, and they've created a partnership with GM. And so now they have access to GM's manufacturing facilities. They have access to GM's knowledge about how to do large-scale, quite complex manufacturing, and can sell these electric boat motors, get them to the market significantly faster. And then GM gets access to this idea of like, well, how do electric motors work? How do you make sure you are able to deliver power in certain ways, etc. Either because they want to utilize some of that knowledge for their own uses within cars, or maybe they want to, say, produce a foothold within the boating industry. Maybe they just want to see Pure Water Sports become a successful company, and they can say, put their name to it and say, look, we've helped this innovation there.
Now, from a purely selfish point of view, so what are some of the, obviously I'm looking at it from a startup's point of view, but now looking at it from trying to understand, I think it's always important to understand both perspectives and both sides of the story. So what are some of the considerations that, let's say, mature companies need to bear in mind or need to consider before looking at or choosing a venturing? I know you're going to say it depends. but what are some of the considerations that mature companies should look at when they're trying to actually pick a method other than it depends? Well, I know it depends, but everything depends. And why would they do this? I mean, why would they choose sort of one over the other? We're looking at potential results, as you mentioned. How can we both benefit? How can we both grow? We're trying to find a way to. Of course, I'm thinking of the pitfalls here, right? You've got a small company that's partnering with a big company. At the moment, I see pitfalls. I'm just saying. But what are some of the things that corporate companies are considering when they do this, or what do you see as a VC when you see these innovation strategies happening or venturing mechanism going on? Can't wait a second, you're on mute. There we go, you're off now.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. You just don't want to answer the question. You're trying to find time.
So hopefully I am coming through.
Yes.
Good. So what I was going to say is from like a mature company's perspective, the most common and the most popular thing that we talk about is like M&A acquisitions. And I think from a startup's perspective, this is also a very valuable exit. There's a whole number of reasons why a mature company will do an M&A acquisition. Largely, it's for strategic reasons, which is that a startup that's maybe a little bit more mature has developed technology that's valuable to them, and there's a belief that they can integrate that technology into their existing, ecosystem. Maybe just a popular example could be Facebook and Oculus, which was the VR goggles, right? This is technology which Facebook saw. They didn't want to develop themselves. Oculus had gotten to a point where an acquisition made a lot of sense for them to pursue this new line of VR gaming. Now the metaverse, several years later, I don't know how long the metaverse had been stuck in Zuckerberg's head, but we can assume quite some while. That's a really good and quite a successful, I would argue, example of an acquisition going well. A lot of acquisitions struggle for a few reasons. This idea of culture and cultural, I guess, friction that you'll see between the different mindsets that you have from, say, corporate versus startup. Often, depending on the size of the M&A transaction, maybe not all the value is actually captured, or all the synergies, or all the market, et cetera, is realized. And so sometimes these sort of things can seem to be maybe less fruitful than initially thought. But this is a very big way forward, or a big cornerstone of a way that companies do innovation.
But
and
when that happens,
before it, and this stage came maybe about 20 years ago. It's this concept of like acqui-hires, where you buy a startup, not for the startup, but for the people who work there. And this is this like trying to fill this cultural gap or talent gap that some of these more mature companies do, where it's an early stage company, they love the team, they kind of like the technology, but they feel like if they bring them in-house, they can go significantly bigger. Or maybe they like the technology enough that they're actually acquiring that technology, but maybe it's a little bit too technology, user base, idea, whatever. But maybe it's not mature enough yet that they're actually purchasing the company more for the team than for what they're doing at the moment.
Do you think that's myopic?
This is one big way of like realizing that value going forward.
Do you think that's a myopic way of seeing an M&A, for example?
Hear you.
Can you?
For some reason. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can everyone hear me? Today we've got no technical problems at all, as you can see. It's all going really well. It's running smoothly. Startup style. But can you hear me, Oliver?
No, I still can't hear you, which is...
Right, so what I'll do is I'll bring on a question from... Here we go. So
I'm assuming you can still hear me, even though I can't hear you. Oh,
yes,
there we go.
We can hear you. So Clay's question, he's just he's thrown up for you, Oliver, is if you think that startups are innovating, in inverted commas, better in terms of market research than more established organizations, for example.
Yeah, it depends what you mean by like market research. Do I think startups as a whole are doing that? That's an interesting question. I think startups have the ability to do that, partly because they are able to adapt their product specifically to what they're doing with it, right? And that's where you get startups pivoting quite a lot. So they have the ability to, say, create a whole new market niche if they wanted to. They tend to be very in touch with like really early stage customers. And they probably have a higher degree of like customer interaction for, say, MVP launches, etc. because they're actually just purely building that product for those, 2, 3, 400 people, first-time users that are using it, and then refining it. Do they have a better idea in terms of like holistic market? No, because they just don't have access to the data. This is my assumption, and I could be very wrong. Do I think every startup has this? Well, no, because a lot of startups unfortunately fail.
But do they fail? They fail because of who was it? Most startups fail because they lack oxygen, aka money. Who was it that said that?
I don't know. That is accurate. and yeah, maybe their failure rates, you could attribute to a whole bunch of stuff. Lacking money being one of the big reasons, too much competition, etc. I also think that some startups just never really find product market fit. And more mature organizations, I think by definition, have some variation or some product market fit there, if that makes sense.
I think that's interesting, though. If you look at it that way, corporate or large organizations have a customer base. So product market fit is largely, and you can argue me here, is largely having a customer base to sell that product to. You can have the best product in the world. If no one knows about it, you're you're dead. But you can have the worst product in the world, have a huge customer base that know you, and purchase you just for your name or just who you are.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a way of looking at it. I think if you only have one client and they're the ones who are paying all the bills as a startup, or you've got 2 clients, obviously you're going to build this to try and fit with them as much as possible. Off of maybe a few assumptions that what 1 or 2 clients, what works really well for them will work for other clients in a similar situation. It's more that transition phase that you have to go through as you grow a startup, where I think it becomes a little bit more interesting. So there's this concept of like the chasm, and how startups, usually it's tech startups, but I think this is applicable to all startups, need to cross this like valley of death or so, where it's really easy to get low-hanging fruit in terms of user acquisition. There are always people who are going to buy the newest piece of technology or whatever, and so you spend a little bit of money, you're able to capture them. But then you need to jump this chasm, which is a group of users who are maybe not predisposed to going out and trying the newest things. And so you spend significantly more money on them, and this is where you kind of, I guess, potentially transfer from like the build to the scale, or maybe from the scale to the more mature ramping up of revenues that you've got to go through. So, depending on how big you're talking about market sizing, do I think startups have a better market research? Maybe for the very low-hanging fruit, but because not all of them have gone through that scale up yet, I think they probably have a lot to learn. And this is often why you see this interconnection between like customer acquisition costs, how often maybe initially it's quite high, and then it's quite low, and then over time, usually customer acquisition costs go up for pretty much every company.
We're going back to that S again, aren't we?
Yes. Yeah.
The whole.
And this is often where like partnerships with large organizations can be really beneficial to startups, because you can help facilitate that market, maybe that market research or that market like positioning, etc. So I kind of gave 2 different answers there, which contradicted each other.
Best way to do it. You don't like one, you've got the other.
Yeah.
They can always come back and argue us. But so a brief summary, just to go over a little bit what we've seen today. So what we've spoken about are the main problems with, it's not just the fact that you need an innovation strategy, but it's how you do it. Some of the trade-offs, KPIs.
Yeah, it's aligning KPIs with both your larger corporate strategy and your innovation strategy. Quite often companies will create like corporate venturing units, like corporate VCs with the expectation they're going to see returns in like 2 or 3 years. But most VC funds don't see returns until like 5 or 6 or 7 years time. And that's an example of like KPIs misaligned.
That's interesting though. Of course, I would always say to you, as a VC, we'll break even in 3 years' time. It's sort of like our magic number. But having said that, some of the most profitable companies in the world, were in debt until not very long ago. Amazon was still in debt, and I don't know if they're still in the red numbers that they used to be in. But you build a company and you scale it with debt. Not always. Yeah. So far, we've bootstrapped ours, but open to investors. But I mean, a lot of the companies that you see succeed have succeeded with debt. The difference is what you're saying, and I understand, which is, where is that point? I was talking to an investor that said to me, yes, yeah, but we're looking at year over year return on investments. He said, well, that's not a startup then. You're looking at the wrong investment vehicle.
Yeah, so I want to make a caveat here because you've used the term debt, and it's not actually.
No.
You're ideally not growing with debt. I mean, you certainly could do. It might be a huge mistake long term.
But for me, it is.
But
okay.
what you're doing is you're growing. You're not focused on profitability or being like cash flow positive. And I think if that's what you mean by debt, then yeah, that's a common thing, and that's why you get venture capital funding, is to fill that gap because you want to spend significantly more money than maybe you could normally afford to do on growth, whether it's marketing, whether it's
that's it,
whatever it is. While actually taking out debt is maybe a little bit too risky for everybody concerned, including VCs that see companies that have a ton of debt on their books. I'm not sure how many of them would be overly excited by that prospect as well. But return on investment is how much is the VC or any other investor going to get back at the end of the day? And often for early stage companies, because of the complexity of like valuing them and their growth, etc., they look more at revenues. So how much are you going to grow revenues more than anything else? The Amazon situation that you talked about is pretty common, which is it's like becoming optionally profitable. Right? So you're not profitable, but only because you're choosing to spend whatever revenues you're bringing in on growth. And as soon as you stop growing, you will then become profitable. That's an ideal scenario, I would argue.
I think this could be a really good conversation for another day. How to spend money.
How to spend, yeah.
The optional way to spend money. However, I think that will be next month. Let me have a look. Next month, I've already chosen our topic for next month. Here you go, your little surprise.
Oh, amazing. 7 myths.
Yes. Well, we can change that. It can be 8 or 9 if you like, but I like the number 7. It's my lucky number. So I thought it's always it's a good number, isn't it?
It is a good number. I will come up with, I mean, there probably are hundreds of myths around corporate venturing, depending on what altitude you look at the topic.
I thought there would be. So I've investigated a little bit, and more or less I sort of boxed them into 7, or at least 7 things I want to ask you about anyway, whether they're a myth or they're not. But I thought that's something we can definitely do with you. So we'll be talking to you the first Wednesday of every month. Is that correct, Oliver?
Yeah, apparently it's yes.
Yes. So anyone can email or DM us your questions, DM Oliver your questions, DM me your questions. Let me just see if you've got you've definitely got my LinkedIn. And Oliver, would you like to let us know your LinkedIn is?
It's just Oliver Fazania. There's only one. Such a unique name like that. So yeah, I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn.
So let me just remind you everyone how you spell Oliver's name.
Yeah.
And this is how we can find him on LinkedIn, so that we can DM any questions that we might have for the next month's session with Oliver. And next week, in fact, we'll be talking about lead gen versus demand gen with Clayton Simmons. So that'll be an exciting conversation. And Oliver, you're more than welcome to join us if you'd like, or if you have any questions. And just want to say thank you very much for talking with us today about innovation strategies. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm sure I'll have so many more questions when I leave today, but I've learned a lot, and I loved some of the slides that you showed us. I'm actually going to show you my favorite slide. This is my favorite slide. I think this is the one that impacted me the most today. So yes, thank you for everything, Oliver.
No, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks again. So see you all later, and speak to you next week, and to you next month, Oliver. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.